We're going to talk about Jerry's marvelous novel, Ravage and Son. It's set on the Lower East Side about 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago. And one of the main characters is Abraham Cahan, who was the editor of the Forward, known then as the Forwitz, Yiddish language newspaper that back then had a circulation of nearly 150,000 in Yiddish, and it was a daily newspaper. What's interesting is the Forwitz building was at 225 East Broadway. My mother's, the mother Jerry alluded to, her father lived in the Bialystocka home for Jewish men, which was at 225 East Broadway, kind of catty corner. And although the Lower East Side, which is considered the cradle of immigrant Jews in America, where they came, were close, were loyal to each other, worked hard, loved and raised their children so that they could have a share of the American dream. The story of immigrant Jews on the Lower East Side that we see, for example, nonfiction in Irving Howe's The World of Our Fathers, that is not the world you will read in Ravage and Son, I hope. Jerry, here as in other books, is to me, in many ways, the Dickens of America, but more than Dickens. The book it teems with anecdotes, with characters, with history, with a sense of place. You will meet in this book people of the time. You will meet Frank Woolworth. You will meet Jacob Schiff. You will meet I don't want to give anything away for something I'm going to say later. But you will meet Henry James. It's a wonderful chapter. And I just want to read a little portion to give you a sense of the language, what Jerry likes to call the music of Jerry's prose. And this is early on in the novel, when Cahan takes Henry James, the master, who was called the master in the novel, to Ellis Island. Cahan expected him to be equally irascible once they landed on Ellis Island. Yet the master's cheeks began to contort, and his lips trembled and turned ashen, while both of them stood on the bridge overlooking the Great Wall and watched the new horde of immigrants climb the stairs of the station, with inspectors plucking at their coats, shouting at them in a babble of tongues with that inevitable question in Yiddish or English, in Russian or Greek: "Are you an anarchist?" While doctors poked at them once they arrived on the second floor and chalked the coat of some pathetic boy with a congenital disease, had him put inside a wire cage. The whole relentless panorama was visible to the master and Cahan, women standing naked and trembling behind the curtain, boys waiting in line with their private parts exposed, a a maze of metal railings everywhere. Men and women were lost in that maze, with nowhere to wander, nowhere to flee. And Kahan heard one almost inaudible sob as the master stood with a crumpled silk handkerchief in his chubby fist. I cannot bear it, Kahan, all this misery. We have to go. And Jerry's, the world you will encounter here, this Lower East Side is a world, as he says, a Yiddish land packed with whores and thieves, full of violence, pickpockets, gangs. Read about people being tortured, robbed, beaten nearly to death. It is not the world of, some of you may know, of Sam Levinson. It is not the world of our fathers that's so idealized often. But it is a very true, well-etched, I would say, portrait, or painted portrait, as if by Hieronymus Bosch, of what life was really like for those people and for that time. I said Dickens comes to mind, but it's as if Jerry's voice as a storyteller is also informed by our forebears and his, the Russian writers, Gogol and Babel. And I want to begin by asking Jerry the most obvious question. Our grandparents, our families come from here. But why, after all these years? I should also mention that Jerry's first published novel, Once Upon a Droshky, is also set on the Lower East Side. It's about the Jewish theater, which was very vibrant in the early years of the 20th century. But what was it that, I wouldn't say inspired you, compelled you to want to create a world of the Lower East Side that you call Ravage and Son?
Well, Jay, when I was a kid, my grandparents lived on the Lower East Side on Henry Street, which is exactly 1 block behind Forward. So I always saw the Forward building when we went to Henry Street. And it's thanks to Tammany Hall, which made my grandfather a citizen so that he could vote for Tammany Hall, that I'm here, because otherwise I would have died in Europe. But what I would do when I went to the Lower East Side, my father and mother insisted that I go with them every Sunday. We went down there. They hated my father. They couldn't bear to look at him. And of course they hated me. And so I never stayed with them when my parents went down there. What I would do was walk around the Lower East Side. And there was something magical about the place, and probably no one will see it, and I don't know if Chase saw it, but there's a mention of Lionel Ravage when he seduces women. He talks about Shakespeare and Caliban. And for me, the Lower East Side was a kind of magical island where Caliban sort of presided over. So it's a Lower East Side of my imagination. It's a 5-year-old, 6-year-old boy wandering the streets and seeing these wonders, pictures of the Yiddish theater, and we have a Yiddish actress, Clara Carr.
Clara Carr.
We have the Williamsburg Bridge and the entrance of Brooklyn into Manhattan. So the Lower East Side, for me, was my ancestral home. It's really where I grew up. And at some point, I wanted to write about it, but write about it as a deadly place and a magical place. and this is why I set the novel. At the beginning of the century, just before immigration was cut off and Jews couldn't come to America anymore, after 1924, Jews from Eastern Europe were not allowed to enter the United States. So don't think of Trump as being an anomaly. In 1916, 1920, you had 150 Trumps in the Senate.
Yeah. The book also seemed to me at the beginning, it begins also with Lionel Ravage, who owns a plumbing business,
Right.
which to me suggests, especially in this wonderful opening paragraph, and the word that shot out to me was the word dross. But it also, for me, made me pay attention to the fact that the book was not going to be about only, let's say, about the magical parts, but about what's underneath,
Yes.
what's in the walls, what's in the basements, what rots away under there all the time. But also in terms of the father-son story, Shakespeare is here literally with Carp, the woman who plays Hamlet, as I believe Sarah Bernhardt did,
Yes.
actually, in those years, a great Jewish actress. But it's also, it seems to me, biblical. And I believe that, I don't know, you can say whether you did or it was just instinct, that his son, who becomes pretty much the main character in the narrative, his son Ben, whom he sends to Harvard from the Lower East Side, and Ben then comes back, and because we're in the Mysterious Bookshop, because Ben becomes a detective for the Kehillah. Now the Kehillah is the Hebrew word for the Jewish councils. So the detective agents, the detectives who are working for Lionel Ravage in the Lower East Side work for the Kehillah. But his name is Ben, which is, for me, an echo of the youngest son, Benjamin. And I wonder if, and Benjamin, which in Hebrew means son of my years, son of my old age. And he becomes like the prince, as he was in the Bible. Is that what you?
Well, I think that was probably more unconscious, and you're being such a wonderful reader, you're seeing things that only remain sort of subterranean for me. But the book is about this feud between father and son,
Yeah.
and also Ben Ravage, who's illegitimate, goes through Harvard Law School, and instead of working for a New York law firm and making millions, goes back to the Lower East Side. Now, why? Why does he go back to the Lower East Side? Because that's the only place he feels comfortable in, I think, Jay.
Yeah, but what is it? As much as you and I, we're distant, neither of us grew up there.
No.
My father was born like a block away from where the Tenement Museum is now, and then they moved to Brooklyn. Why does even saying the Lower East Side, why does that evoke so much in us?
Well, for one thing, it was a place where Jews thrived. I mean, even as poor as they was, and they were taken advantage of, it was the Jewish Lower East Side, and Temple Emmanuel, which is now so fancy, on the East Side, began on the Lower East Side. It was a dump. And the thing is, we forget our own past. And what I wanted to do was to evoke in a magical way this place where I was spiritually born. I don't know, Jay, if you feel the same way, but for me it's a kind of, when When I was in my 30s, I went to the Lower East Side every day. It's not the way it is now, completely gentrified. You saw the tenements, and I felt comfortable there. I felt it was a home.
No, I didn't. Both my mother and father families had moved to Brooklyn before
Yeah,
I was
of course,
born.
Brooklyn is your...
That's
is
my turf.
Yes.
My literary turf. And that's the world that holds magic for me. But the book, yes, magical, and there are passages of great beauty in the book. I emphasize the dark view. I would call it the dark poetry of the book, because I think that's what makes it unique. But there is beauty in the book. My favorite character in the book, is the cat, Chloe.
Chloe.
Chloe the cat, actually, and when Jerry sent me an advance copy of the book, Jerry and Lenore have a cat, and I believe she's probably the basis for Chloe
Yes.
at some level.
She is
And he
Chloe.
sent me a book, With Love, from Jerome, Lenore, and Ketzel. Their cat is named Ketzel, and he wrote Picture, so here's their cat. But Chloe is a great creation. But the dark stuff, Jerry, we have done more than survive, as have many of our generation, whose grandparents were immigrants.
Yeah.
What of what you found magical has been lost along the way, and that informs so much of the sadness of the book?
Well, I think it's the predicament about the modern world. Jay and you and I went to college together. I'm not going to say your parents were poorer than mine. It's not a pissing contest. But my parents were very poor, and yet Jay and I had the best damn education in the world. We had Lionel Trilling, who was the most famous English professor, at our feet. He didn't want to teach in a graduate school. He wanted to teach undergraduates. Jay and I were in the colloquium. We met with 10 students, one of whom is a Nobel Prize winner, the other of whom is a former president of a distinguished university. And we met with 2 professors, and we drove those professors out because these students were so interested in books. And it just seems to me that this world, I don't know about Columbia College now, but the world of the Lower East Side, the world of possibility, is no longer there. You cannot afford to be poor and to stay alive. I lived in a one room, which was part of a doctor's office. I tell you, I could have lived there for the rest of my life. I was totally happy. My desk faced the wall. I met my wife, Lenore. She was a student. What I would do is teach high school twice a week. And if you registered at one school, they would call you first. So I knew I would always work twice a week. I had enough money to live on, and I could stay there for the rest of my life, except that one of my books was published. So at that point, universities suddenly became interested in writers, and Jay and I began to earn a living. But it just seemed to me that the Lower East Side, which is where, my own, and by the way, Jay grew up in Brooklyn, which has its own vitality. I grew up in the Bronx, which has none. Which only has the Bronx Zoo. And even that, I'm not sure really is an illusion. So it seems to me that being from Brooklyn, you had a home. I had none. I only had the Lower East Side. I wanted to write about a place of possibility where even though, and also the Bintel brief, which was the letters to the editor that were sent to the editor of the Forward, Abraham Kahan, and what he would do was revise them and create them, make them poetic. It seemed to me you no longer have the possibility of being both poetic and poor. And I think that that's what was important to me.
Yeah, well, as a people, you know, they were what, at that point over 1 million,
Yeah.
maybe close to 2 million Jews in the it was the most densely
It's the
populated.
dense part, more than New Delhi.
Yeah, more than, yes, place in the world, but again, remember that we are not known as the people of the book for nothing.
Yeah.
And more historically, you know, this is an over-reduction, but we're the people of the book because never having been allowed to own land and having been driven from country to country, we took what was transportable, and what we could take with us was what was in here.
Exactly.
And Jewish boys then, not women, early on, had to learn to read early on, which also differentiated us. But I want to switch now from your book
Yeah.
for a second to what you were talking about, which is you've had a brilliant career. You've published novels, short stories, mysteries, you've written screenplays, and a wonderful book on ping pong. More than 50 books in all these years. What, and we agree, we talk about this a lot, that when we arrived at Columbia, it was a place where everything about the undergraduate college said to us, literature, writing, the word and language are important. Nothing is more important. And everybody then, including pre-meds, pre-law, engineering, future Wall Street people, every student had to spend 2 years reading humanities, philosophy, sociology, taking languages.
In CC, you had to read the original text.
Yes.
You had to read Augustine and Darwin, literally, they're very complex.
Very complex, and you had to read a lot. I read on the subway 2 hours a day, and by the end of the first year, I had to wear glasses, which I never
So
did.
did I. I went to the movies one day, I couldn't see the screen, I didn't understand.
But we were and Jerry and I were in the first writing class we took, not freshman comp, but a writing class our second year together. So that's 67 years ago. And we both wrote, we were allowed to take a supervised study with a professor, and we each wrote a novel while we were undergraduates. What, in all these years, all these books with more to come, what's changed the most, Jerry, for you?
That's a very good question, Jay.
Yeah.
I would have to say, the only thing that's changed is my eyesight. I feel the same delight when I sit in front of the page and look for the music of a sentence. I don't feel any different. I am a writer of sentences. Those sentences, when they come together, accidentally form something else. Now, very often I know the last line of the book, and it takes me about a month to write the first line. But it seems to me the process isn't different. The pain is there, and the joy is there, and I would ask the same thing to you. I'm wondering.
Yeah, I'm thinking there's a sentence I found in an article by a friend of mine, who Jerry knows also, the writer Lynn Sharon Schwartz. She says, on the day when I write one good sentence, I'm a happy person. And yeah, for me, yeah, all kinds of bad things could be happening in my life or around me. Once I get to my desk, and once I begin to type, or to write by hand, or to correct, everything else disappears. Yeah, for me, it still does. And when I have a good day, I want to, do my Fred Astaire stuff around the room. Unfortunately, sometimes I think, oh, what a day. Oh, I wrote 4 pages or 5 pages. I said, oh, so good. And then I look the next day at what I did, and it's, if you know the story of the blind man at the Passover Seder, when they pass around the matzah, and he goes like this. He says, who wrote this shit? And sometimes the next day I look at what I've written and I said, oh my God, why did I think this was good? But the joy of writing and the desire to do it, and the fact, there's something else, I think, with writing fiction especially, compared to other kinds of writing, screenplay, nonfiction, is I don't really ever know when I begin something, a long book or on a given day, what is going to happen next.
But that's the fun.
And that is the joy of it.
And also, it's difficult work. It's back-breaking work. I mean, if you didn't get any joy out of it, it's not worth anything. I mean, it's not worth the money you might receive. It's not worth the praise you might receive and the damnation which comes along with it. It's too difficult. If you don't really love what you're doing, stop doing it.
Yeah.
Because it's just not worth it.
Oh, yeah. No, we agree on this, as you know. But take the question to another level. What about the world of books, literature, publishing, in which we put out what we produce? How has that changed, or how has your attitude toward what you write changed?
Well, I think that world has changed completely from the time we both began, which my first story was published in 1963 in a magazine called Commentary, in a magical way, which at that point was not a right-wing magazine, where I was very born. I don't know, literary magazine, and I think, Jay, your first stories, one of your first stories was published there. But when I had that story published, I didn't have an agent, I didn't have anything. I immediately got 6 offers from 6 publishers, and like an idiot, I chose the best letter and the poorest publisher. Excuse me?
Which was that?
No, I don't want to say. But the thing was, I love the editor I work with, and it was a different world, because when you were with a publisher, your first novel wasn't expected to sell enormously, because remember, in 1963, you were almost guaranteed 500 sales from libraries. Libraries bought every book that came out from a major publisher. So publishers, in spite of what they say, didn't lose money on your first book. And they didn't expect to make money. They thought, well, they would carry you for 4 or 5 books, and by the 5th book, maybe you would make $50. You'd be happy, and they'd be happy, because they also had bestsellers. But that's not true anymore. You have one spin of the dreidel. In other words, if you're the new hot young writer, you have one chance. And it just seems to me that it's a world of money now. It's no longer, as a matter of fact, there were editors when I was young who weren't even paid. They were very, very rich, and they wanted to edit books. So it was not about making money, it was about publishing what you thought was literature. That word no longer exists. Erica, please forgive me if I say that because it exists for you, but it hardly exists anywhere else. It's merchandise. And I am not a maker of merchandise, and I don't think Jay is either. And that's one reason why we suffer.
Who suffers?
Jay, you suffer. I speak to you 3 times a week. You suffer. You don't want to admit it. You suffer. I suffer. But it doesn't really matter. We are doing what we want to do, and there's nothing else I would ever want to do.
Yeah, there's a wonderful story by Will Cather. I don't remember the title. A wealthy young woman living near, I think, Washington Square becomes friendly with an artist, struggling artist, an artist, a painter. And she sees that he's always in his kind of cramped quarters painting. And she's being courted, she's looking for a husband by various wealthy men. And she says to him as she's going out one day, you know, you really shouldn't stay here so many hours. You should get out into the world. And, you know, you should indulge yourself. And he hasn't said much in the story. Again, if you know the story, someone correct me later. But he says, oh my dear, I have the greatest indulgence in the world, for every day I do what I love. And I think this is what Jerry is referring to. And maybe we'll transition out, Jerry.
Yeah.
I'd love
sure.
to talk more about what I loved and about the novel and its complexity, its ironies, its texture. There's a marvelous texture.
The texture is the important word.
Yeah, marvelous texture. You know, open it any page and you'll feel it and sense it. But let's turn it over to you, and if you have questions for Jerry about the book,
Or Jay.
about his suffering. That was, when I said why I suffered, that was with a Yiddish intonation. Who suffers?
Well, you don't know everybody here, so I had to sort of explain what you meant.
Yeah. So, questions about Ravage and Son, about the book, about writing, publishing,
I have a question.
ping pong.
Yeah, I was so taken about the darkness that you described in the beginning of the book, yet when I hear you speak about the east side of your youth,
Yeah.
you don't talk about the darkness, you talk about the magic. So I wonder why you went that way in this book.
That's a very good question because I wasn't writing about myself. I was writing about the modern world and how dark it's become. So if I had written this book in 1964, you wouldn't have seen all that darkness. But I don't know how other people feel, but we are losing it as a country. And it just seems to me that my own feelings, my own anxieties, my own beliefs have turned to a kind of anger. This was the country of opportunity. Even if you were poor on the Lower East Side, you still had a chance to survive. But that chance to survive is no longer there. So it's about a kind of Jack the Ripper who was, because I wrote the prologue after I wrote the book, and the prologue changed the entire book. I rewrote the entire book after I wrote the prologue, and after I got the cat Chloe, because Chloe, Lenore will say that my wife, who's my lovely wife, my lovely redhead, will say that I love the cat first and then I love her second, which isn't true. But Chloe really runs our life, and Chloe is an animal. She's wild. And Chloe is an animal. 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 And Chloe And the cat in this book is wild. And this is what I wanted to write about.
So you took the darkness of today and
Yes.
put it into what you knew best, the Lower East Side of that.
Yes, but that darkness, there was, I didn't want any, the words, I know maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh, but the one word I cannot stand is sentimentality. That means an over-emotion about something that
False
you
emotion.
see. No, I wouldn't say false, Jay, because false already makes it interesting. I would say you overextend something and you go from what's there to something that's not there. And I'm not contradicting you, I would use a different word. So the Lower East Side that I return to is the Lower East Side that, and I've said this story before, when I was in my 60s and living in France, and I thought I was losing my memory, so I went to a specialist, and she gave me a test, say 5 things and give me 5 fingers. And she said, you have a lot of problems. You couldn't even be a college student now. And I said, well, that's interesting because I'm a college professor. And she also said, there's so much electricity in your brain, and this is a bad sign. There's just too much going on, and I don't know what to make of it. And I would say, well, if you wrote a novel, you would know what to make of it. As Jay understands, a novel is almost impossible to write, and Ben Haywood's a friend of mine from school is also here and also writes novels, and he would probably agree.
Yeah.
Right, and Steve Graffel is here, and I'm sure there are other novelists that I'm blind in one eye. That's a lie. I like to say that. But
Nice
the
with
thing
it.
is, to write a novel is almost an impossibility. And it seems to me that the novel I wanted to write about the Lower East Side, to answer your question, was the Lower East Side that I remembered, but the Lower East Side as it stands for the world itself and what has happened to the world. The darkness that has sort of taken over almost everywhere. You cannot be poor today. I was poor as a child, I was poor as a young adult, and I didn't feel poor. It didn't matter to me. Now it matters because you can't survive. And so I was writing about Ben, okay, who has a Harvard degree, could go to, a New York law firm, make millions. No, he goes back to the Lower East Side because that's the world that matters to him. And that's the world that's in his mind. And I think Jay would probably agree.
Oh, yeah. I would have things to say, but other questions? I saw some other hands up.
Well, I'd like to know what you're writing now and what you're writing next.
Well, I'm writing 2 books. Erica, you should not listen to me. I'm writing a book about a boy who's 9 years old. He lives in a hotel. He's abandoned by his father. And he lives in a building called the Concourse Plaza, which most of you would know, or some of you would know. It was the first sort of cooperative hotel in the Bronx. So if you had a certain amount of money, I think it was put up in the 20s or the 30s, you could, live there. So the boy's father disappears. The boy's father is a crook, and the boy is 9 years old, and he sort of becomes a runner for a lawyer, that is, a criminal lawyer who doesn't go to court because he doesn't have to, he's too smart, but he needs a runner to tell his compatriots in criminal court what to do. So the boy lives there alone, makes enough money because he's this high-powered teller of information, and it's about his life. At the same time, I'm also writing, I wanted to try a novel for young adults, which is really the story of my life, but retold from a different point of view, from someone who's not poor, but who grew up where I grew up, and went to the same high school, and I dedicate it to the people I went to high school with, and I dedicate it also to my brother. But I wanted to reimagine my life as a different person, going to the same school, falling in love with a young woman who has polio, and becoming part of their family with a father who's crazy as my father was crazy, a mother who was beautiful as my mother was beautiful. But they weren't immigrants. I didn't want to write an immigrant tale. I wanted to write a tale about America. So I'm going back and forth between these two books. And I've also written a story about Wittgenstein. I don't know how many of you know the philosopher Wittgenstein, who was the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and no one could understand his work. And I found a way into his work because he was as crazy as I am and couldn't bear to be around other people as I can. I have problems with any group, but it doesn't really matter. But anyway, he wrote two books which are utterly incomprehensible. What is most important, he's the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and all he ever wrote about was grammar. He said, sentences are ambiguous. You can't understand them. You take any sentence and put it on the blackboard, and I'll give you 1,000 meanings. Well, I found a way of getting into his life because he was the distinguished professor of philosophy at Cambridge, but he left Cambridge to become a teacher in an elementary school. And why? Because he wanted to learn language, to relearn it as children learned it. And then during the Second World War, he went to a hospital. He gave up his professorship and became a deliverer of medicine in a hospital. And what he did, he visited German prisoners of war. And I began to wonder, why was he interested? Because he saw these prisoners of war as his former students, and he was very cruel as a teacher. And it seemed to me that the real key to his writing was his visiting these students, these prisoners of war during the Second World War. So maybe no one will understand this, it doesn't really mean anything, but I had an incredible pleasure writing this story. It gave me an enormous amount of, first of all, reading Wittgenstein's books, trying to understand what he was saying, and then writing the story.
Where can we read that story?
It hasn't been published yet, but Lenore can send you a PDF if you're interested. I'm very happy.
Tell them about your next book.
I already did one.
The next book to be published.
Oh, the next book to be published will
The
be
publisher's
published.
sitting here.
Just
I
wondering
forgot
if
about that book
rescinded
because it's what happened. It's a book about Maria Callas. Now what happened? I know nothing about opera, and one day Lenore and I, my wife Lenore, was standing up, my wonderful redhead, who was angry at me because I didn't notice her beautiful red hair today. We're fighting, but I think maybe the fight is over.
I made up.
She has no other choice. But the thing is that we saw a documentary together about Maria Callas. I never saw an opera, I never saw Maria Callas perform. But I fell in love with her. There was something about her. She was not, if you want an opera career, you have to be pretty wealthy, just as, prior to recently, you had to be pretty wealthy if you wanted to be a tennis player, because you needed a coach, et cetera, et cetera. And as an opera singer, you generally came from a middle class background. Well, Maria Callas did not. She came from a very poor background. And there was something about her that made me fall in love with her. And I told my wife that I'm going to divorce her for a dead woman. Because I absolutely fell in love with Maria Callas. And I needed to write about her, though I only saw one opera in my whole life, and I've seen it 6 times, and that's Don Giovanni. And I love it. It's not that I love Don Giovanni, I love the back and forth between Don Giovanni and his servant, Leporello. And there's something about the opera that is so powerful. It reminds me of King Lear in a way. But anyway, this is the next book that Erica will be publishing. It's Maria Callas. I don't know, I have a title, but I assume that Erica is going to make you change it. The book will probably be called Callas. Not that it matters, but anyway, it's about how she became an opera singer and her later life. She had a run-in with Jackie Kennedy, you know, I don't need to tell you the stories of Onassis and Jackie Kennedy. But anyway, the love of her life was Onassis, and he foolishly threw her aside and married Jackie Kennedy, who spent $1 million a year buying dresses that she never wore and resold. And of course, he was rich enough to support the $1 million that she took from him, but he was going to divorce her when he became ill, and he died, and that was the end of Maria Callas's life. She was utterly in love with him, even though she was a married woman who never divorced her husband. But I felt that I was a male version of Maria Callas, even though I can't sing a note. Anyway, I fell in love with her.
I thought, before we take another question, that because of the book is in Yiddish, that we could now discuss some of the things we didn't get to, but
Sure.
do it in Yiddish.
Yeah. Moshe, you're better than I am.
No.
Even though I studied Yiddish as a kid, I can understand.
Just kidding. Question, Karen.
Go ahead. This is a friend of mine, Karen Kennedy, who I've known
Since '68.
since '68.
For all these decades, I've never heard you say anything the way you answered that woman's question. In other words, it's dark because you brought the darkness of the present to the novel about the past. And that if you had written it at another time, the novel about the Lower East Side would not have been that dark. What about your other books? Can you think of other books, novels that you've written that also reflect the time in which they were written?
Well, my first novel, which was Once Upon a Drushki, which is about a Yiddish actor, he was thrown out of his apartment again because, the landlord can get rid of him, I don't think it has that darkness, Karen. I don't think I'm a comic writer.
Yeah.
I believe in comedy. I don't know if Jay would agree with me, but I think I want to make people laugh. And I want to make them cry. I want to make you laugh, and then at the end of the book, I want to break your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And this is what I've always felt, but I don't want to get political about it, but since a certain person became president, the world has changed so dramatically that I can no longer think the same way. And I have to find, I don't know how Jay feels, but I really have to find a survival strategy. And I think that this book deals with that survival strategy.
But
That you have to plunge into the darkness.
For example, I don't remember the years. What were you writing and publishing in 2000?
Well, I remember I wrote a book, War Cries Over Avenue C, about the Vietnam War, which is a very dark book, but a very comic book about someone who is a native Vietnamese who really sort of takes over the CIA. In other words, I had a comic element. In other words, the comedy flew over the blackness because one could still live in a comic world. We no longer live in a comic world. Now maybe after we discovered what, recently, the way black people have lived and what has happened to them, it has become apparent, we would also have to say that this was always there, but we didn't really notice it the way we should have noticed it, and we notice it now. And it seems to me that being white is no longer an advantage, it's a disadvantage, because it puts you into the role of someone who's been an aggressor. And it seems to me that we're living in an impossible world.
There's also the, is it 10 Isaac Seidel novels? 12, sorry. I read them all, but Jerry has written, we're in the Mysterious Bookshop, 12 mysteries, crime novels, I would call them, that are wildly comic. I would say even verge on farce or satiric.
Yes, they're
And yet they are, they're satiric, which means they are also profoundly critical of the structures of life, in social and political, in which we live. Yeah, so that the element of looking at what is wrong, what is keeping us from functioning, what may be leading us to the point where we're now, has always been there in your work, Jerry.
But yes, I agree with you, Jay, but you see the farce sort of trumps the darkness. In other words, one could afford to laugh. I don't know about you, but I do have humor in my novels, but I don't laugh anymore. The only time, and Lenore can attest to this, the only time I ever laugh is when I'm with the cat. The cat, because the wildness of this woman, okay, plays up to me. Doesn't play up to Lenore. She doesn't have to. She gets everything she
It's
wants
food
from
for me, and everything else for me.
Yeah.
Yeah, is, if there's no other pressing questions that we could all listen to, why don't, Jerry will be here, he'll sign books, and just, we can hang out together a little bit for a while.
Right.
Thanks very much for our event. Thanks to some of them are already signed. Mr. Chairman will be happy to sign for you. We appreciate everybody coming. Not all.